Today we're going to be learning Siman Peval, Halacha Zayin, and Ches. We'll start first with Halacha Zayin. Shulchan Aruch says, if you have an egg which was laid by a nevela or treifa, we saw earlier that egg is not kosher. You're not allowed to eat that egg. But what happens if the egg hatches into a chick? Then the din is mutter. You're allowed to eat that chick. And we'll explain that in a second. The Rambam says, go ahead and indicate that the Rambam says some people say that you're not allowed to do this, so you should avoid doing that. So the Shulchan Aruch who says that you're allowed to eat the egg, that's coming from a Gemara. The Gemara says in Tamura, the Gemara says that when the reason why the chick is mutter, even though the egg is usher, is because as the egg forms into a chicken, it is masriach, and it becomes afar bi'alma, it rots and it decomposes, so to the point that the chick that grows from this egg is not considered connected to the original mother, the hen that it came from, and therefore, even though the mother was a nevela or treifa, the din is that the chick that's born from this egg is mutter, and you're allowed to eat that chick. So, the Gemara says this, no disagreement, there's no question about that in the Gemara. So the Achronim will ask on the Ramah, why did the Ramah bring such a shita that says you're not allowed to eat it? It seems beferish that you are allowed to eat it, and it should be completely mutter. And in fact, like the Shach says it's a mistake, and the Ramah, it's not true, and the din is not correct, what the Ramah says is not correct, what the Mechaber says is beferish of the Gemara, that the chicken is mutter. So, the Taz says that the reason why a person should be machmir, and what the Ramah is saying that a person should be machmir, is because the problem is like this. If I know that this egg is usher, but if I let it hatch, the chick that comes from it will be mutter. So then what are people going to do? They're going to take the egg and sit a hen on it and let it hatch, because right now it's going to be garbage, so I might as well develop this into a new chicken. And therefore that's a chashash takala, which is to say is, if I leave it around and I let this egg sit around for a while until it hatches, then potentially someone's going to eat it, not realizing that it's a treif egg. It's not noticeable that it's a treif egg. Somebody might eat it, and therefore, from the chashash takala, a person is not supposed to put the egg under the hen. Now, we're going to see next time. There's a question, a serious question on this sheet of the Taz. Many are going to talk about the fact they disagree with it for different reasons. One of those things we're going to speak about next time. But for now, he's saying is that the chick is really mutter, but the reason why the Ramah says not to do it is because the Ramah is concerned that if you do it, you're going to end up, in order to do this, you have to leave the egg around, and therefore to leave the egg around as a chashash takala, and therefore you shouldn't do it. So Ramosha brings a raya from this Taz to the following. He says, the Taz talks about chashash takala. He says, put that on the side for a second. He says, but the Taz seems very happy with the fact that if not for the chashash takala, he would be okay with the person taking this egg, which he realizes is now his treif, putting it under a hen and letting it develop into a chicken. That's what the Taz is saying. That would have been he was perfectly fine with that. So Moshe says, wait a second. He's taking something that's usher, he's turning it into something that's mutter through making it inedible. As I said, the Gemara says it becomes mutter because it's masriach and it becomes afar bi'alma, and he's turning something usher into something mutter through making it inedible. Ramesh says the fact that the Taz is happy with that and says that you're allowed to do that is a raya that there's no the prohibition of Bitul l'chatchila, the aim of l'chatchila, does not apply when a person is making something inedible. I'm not allowed to take something usher and dilute it into heter, but if I take usher, isra, and I do something to make it inedible, that's not a Bitul l'chatchila. He's speaking about this with Indian, the Shiloh gets spoken once about making soap, where we take animal fat, which is also it's nevela and chela, and we turn it into soap, which is inedible. And Ramesh said there's no concern of chila to do something like that. Because that's what Ramesh says based on the Shach. It's just worth noting that Rabbi Yaakov Emden says exactly the opposite. He explains that the reason why the Ramah says you're not supposed to do this, the reason why the Ramah our din says you're not allowed to do, the Ephraim is usher, is not like the Taz. He brings rayas against the Taz, as do many others. He brings rayas against the Taz. He says there's no chashash takala, and it wouldn't apply in this case. He says the reason why the Ramah says you're not allowed to do it is because the chicken really is mutter. Like the Gemara says the chicken is mutter. But you're not allowed to do it because of the chashash takala. That's exactly why why the Ramah says not to do it, is because in order to do it, you'd have to leave the chicken around, the egg around for however long it takes to hatch, and therefore that's what the Ramah meant to not say, which is to say, he's saying is that the reason why for the Ramah is exactly what Ramesh is mutter. The Ramah trying to say is also okay. Ramesh, but says this based on the Chaz, and that's how I think how most people assume. Anyhow, irrespective of whether that's Pshat in the Ramah, but there's no Isser Bitul S'chatiba. Okay, we now turn to Halacha Ches, and that is as follows. Here we're going to talk about blood spots. Halacha Ches Shulchan Aruch says the following: Beitzas oif tameh shehischel ha'oif le'hisrakim ba. If you have a chicken egg, an egg from a non-kosher bird, from an owl, shehischel ha'oif le'hisrakim ba, and the egg started forming into a bird. Like an alam of sheretz oif, if you eat that, there's an isser of eating sheretz oif. This is a sheet of some Rishonim. It's quite a machlokes, not so relevant to us, so we're not going to talk about these details. But if the egg starts to form, then there's an isser of sheretz oif. What happens if you have an egg from a kosher bird, like a chicken egg, and the egg started to form, and a person eats that egg as it's in the middle of forming, then it's only us midrabanan to eat that egg. Again, there's lots of discussion in place from here about exactly why one is us midrabanan and one is us midrabanan, not so relevant to us. But what is relevant to us is, Shulchan Aruch is talking about an egg where it already began developing. We're going to talk about a related question, and that is blood spots. As follows. If you go to a chicken farm and you look at eggs, you find a very small percentage of them actually will have a little speck of blood in the middle of the egg, primarily on the yolk. They'll have a speck of blood on them. Okay, and we call that a blood spot. Now, by the time the egg comes to my house, that I just said when the person goes into a farm, by the time it gets, before they sell it to consumers, they go through a process called candling, which is to say is they shine a bright light through the egg. They used to do it with a candle, that's called candling, and the bright light is so strong it shines through the shell, and a person or a machine watching can pick out the eggs that have blood spots. Blood spots show up as darker spots as it passes by, and they can pick out the ones that have the blood spots and take them out. Which is to say is that it's very uncommon that a consumer will see a blood spot in an egg that they buy. But it does happen. It does happen in a very small amount of time. Again, blood spots in general are very rare, but even when they happen, they're usually caught by the packing house before they put them into the container. But it does happen. Okay, so we saw previously that if an egg had been fertilized, it was a fertilized egg, and there's a blood spot, there's a chashash of shada tichla b'kula. It could be that the egg is already forming, and the entire egg has the status of a chip, and therefore, in that case, we asked for the whole egg. And we spoke about that, and there's questions. Okay, it's that chashash of shada tichla b'kula. What happens if we have an egg which is not fertilized, which is commonly what we have, eggs that were never fertilized by a rooster, so they just came out of the egg to the hen by itself. So those eggs, there's no possibility at that point that a chada tichla b'kula couldn't possibly be the beginnings of an egg starting to form that's now spreading through. There's no chick is ever going to form in this egg. So then, that's not where the blood comes from. The scientists believe that the blood comes the blood spots of being unfertilized eggs come as follows. It's not from the egg from the chick beginning to form, but rather, as we spoke about once beforehand, when the yolk comes out of the ovaries, it comes out through a narrow space in this like sack that it's sitting in, the container that it's sitting in. It has a narrow area that has no blood vessels in it. The surrounding area has blood vessels in it, but there's one strip that has no blood vessels in it. That's called the stigma, and the yolk comes out of its case, which sort of the ovaries where it's being held, through that stigma. It pops out through the stigma. Now, and that's what's supposed to happen. If a blood vessel actually goes across the stigma, there is one growing there as it's not supposed to be, but there is a blood vessel growing, then as the yolk passes through the stigma, it will break that blood vessel, and a drop of that blood could get left on the yolk. Okay, and that's how we understand, how scientists understand how blood spots form in eggs that are not fertilized. Okay, now, in our halacha spoke about what happens when an egg's already started to form. Literally, there's a whole egg, the chick is starting to form inside the egg. And most of the dinim about blood spots are not in our siman. Actually, they're in siman samach vav. Okay, and over there, it starts as follows. The Gemara says like this. We start with the following point. The Gemara says in Kashrus that the blood in an egg is not usher. The Gemara says there's a whole number of eggs, types of blood that are not usher, and one of them is dam bayim. And dam bayim do not have any isser on them. There's no isser. There's no isser on them. No isser. The Torah says that there's no isser of eating blood if a person eats that blood. Then the question is, the Gemara in Chulin speaks about, as we mentioned, that sometimes a blood spot is a concern of shadut tichel b'kul. We start to think that the blood that's here is a sign that there's really blood, that the chick is starting to form, and sometimes it is usher, sometimes the whole egg is usher, sometimes it's not usher. So we're trying to guess what's going on. Is blood of eggs mutter or blood of eggs usher? So we have different answers. The two main answers that Tosfos brings over there one is the Gemara in Kashrus is saying that it's mutter midaraisa. It's based on Xeris Shakasa. There's no basis deraisa. The Gemara in Chulin is telling us that there's no basis deraisa, but there is a draban. So the Gemara in Chulin is sort of a continuation of that Gemara there. And the other pshat is that the Gemara in Kashrus, it says that it's mutter, that says there's no isser on blood spots, is talking about those same spots that the Gemara in Chulin says are mutter. The Gemara in Chulin says some are shadut tichel b'kul, some are not. And so the Gemara in Kashrus says, when it says that there's no isser, it means it's the ones that the Gemara in Chulin already explained to us don't have an isser on them. And as you may remember, the Moshe were machmer all those shilos, but just to answer the stira is that one Gemara with the other one. So the Shacharach, we essentially were machmer for both of these shitas, which is to say we assume there's an isser on blood spots, and some of them we're concerned is of shadut tichel b'kul, and there might even be usher midrais. Okay, now the Ramah says, as I mentioned, the Ramah says that because we're not clear exactly which cases in Chulin are exactly shadut tichel b'kul, there's many different shitas, therefore we assume that any blood spot fertilized in an egg that might have been fertilized, that blood spot is a chashash of shadut tichel b'kul, and the whole egg is usher. Okay, that's all that we've said so far. Or the case now is about fertilized eggs. What happens if we know that the egg is not fertilized? So the Shulchan says that if the egg is for sure not a fertilized egg, then min hadin, the ikar hadin is that the blood spot and the whole egg is completely mutter. But with the Rabbanan, a person should not eat the blood itself because it's a marasayin. It looks like I'm eating blood, and blood, people know that blood is usher, so this looks like I'm doing something wrong, and therefore the Shulchan says a person should not eat the blood part of it because of marasayin. Now, how do I know that whether this is a fertilized egg or not? How am I supposed to figure out whether an egg is or is not fertilized? So the Gemara in a different din having to do with Be'ah and for Yom Tov, the Gemara says there's two ways to know. Either the closest rooster is 60 houses away, or the closest rooster is across of a river that he can't get across, so you know that there's no roosters here. Okay, and that's said not about our din, it's said about din for Hilchos Yom Tov, for Hilchos Muktzah. The place can say that those same din apply here also. The same rules also. It has to be 60 houses away, the rooster, or it has to be across a river. And the Ramah in the Torah's Chata says another thing is if you keep the chickens, the hens in a chicken coop, and you know that in that chicken coop there were no roosters, then you can assume that the eggs that come out of that chicken are non-fertilized because there was no roosters around. Okay, so in fact, for most of our eggs that we get, in fact, meet those criteria. If you think about it, the people who sell eggs commercially, this is not a private little farm, someone in their backyard has some chickens. These people are selling eggs commercially. For them, they have no need to support roosters. They just need hens that lay eggs. The roosters actually is bad for the chickens to have them around, so they have chicken coops with thousands of chickens in them, and there are no roosters to be found. So they qualify, seemingly they qualify as being non-fertilized eggs. It's not, okay, and so there's an added little feature here is that now in more recent years there's something called biosecurity, which is to say is the government is concerned about people, about diseases getting into the food that we eat and things like that, and therefore there's extra controls to make sure that nothing goes into the chicken coop that isn't supposed to, and that includes that there would be no roosters around. So we could be pretty comfortable that there are no roosters and we have non-fertilized eggs. So now there are 2 points to make before I finish up on this side, and that is it's not clear whether free-range chickens, that is chickens that don't have to be dafka in the coop, but they have more ability to go out and about, whether those qualify for these dinim also. You have to know really how the free range works and how loose it is and how available are the roosters, are the hens really able to get all around, and then we have to think about other roosters 60 houses away and things like that. The other thing is something newer, and that is there's a company that came up with a solution to a problem that probably most people never thought of. And the problem is as follows. We've mentioned in the past that we use specific types of chickens to lay eggs. Those are different than the chickens that we use for cooking the actual chicken itself. Those are called broilers. These are egg layers, and the egg layers typically are what they call white leghorn chickens. And so if you think about it, the white leghorn chickens lay eggs all day long. That's all all the time. They sit there and they lay eggs. But obviously there's somebody out there who must be breeding white leghorn chickens to grow more of them so they could have new white leghorns for tomorrow to lay eggs. So there are farmers out there, and those farmers raise hens and roosters of white leghorns in order to produce more and more white leghorns so that they could then spend their life laying eggs. So what happens is those hens lay eggs, and they lay eggs that are allowed to hatch into the new white leghorn chickens. The problem is that only half of those chicks are worth anything because the chicks are only there in order to lay more eggs. The roosters, the males, have no value. What will anybody do with a male white leghorn chicken? Who needs them? So they have a nice term for this, so they cull them, which is say they kill them. After they're a day or two old, they separate them, the males from the females, and the males are all culled. They're all killed. So that's not very pleasant to do, nor is it financially worthwhile to hatch an egg all the way. Half the eggs that you're hatching have no value, so you're sort of wasting your money and your time. So this company came up with a way that as soon as the egg is laid, within a very short amount of time, they can tell which egg is going to turn into a male and which will turn into a female. And what they do is then they take all the male eggs out so that the roosters, then the only ones that they hatch are the female white leghorn chickens, which is what they want. That's great. So they're only raising the female white leghorn chickens. They're only hatching the females. What happens to the males? Well, they said, hey, instead of throwing them in the garbage, they take those eggs and they sell them to people who sell eggs to the consumers. Why not? They're just plain old eggs. They're perfectly fine. So, so what's going to happen is with this technology, would mean is there will be fertilized chicken eggs out in the market. Whereas today, there's basically no fertilized eggs there because they're all laid by chickens that are locked up in coops far away from roosters. And if this technology moves along, there may be a certain percentage of fertilized eggs in the market. Right now, this has not come to market yet. It's something that people are working on and may one day happen. Okay? So, to summarize where we were, before we end off this section, is that the Shulchan Aruch said if you have an egg that's not fertilized, which is what we have, most in our kitchens, we have eggs that are not fertilized. If we have an egg that's not fertilized, and there's a blood spot in it, min hadin, the blood is really mutter, but because of Maris Ayin, the person is not allowed to eat that egg, so you should scoop out the blood and you can eat the rest of the egg. That's what the Ikra Hadin will be. What Ramesh says, as do many others, that the minig is to throw out the entire egg. Okay? Even though nowadays we know it's from a non-fertilized egg, even so the minig is that we throw out the entire egg, just like it was in the olden days when we didn't know it. In the olden days when we had an egg that was from possibly a fertilized egg, we were not able to eat the rest of the egg. We had to throw it out. So Ramesh says that nowadays, even though we have non-fertilized eggs, we should do, the minig is to do the same thing and to throw it out. Okay? Just a side little shiloh. We once mentioned that there's such a thing as an egg that has two yolks in it. So Dayan Weiss has a truth about whether if you have a blood spot in one of the yolks should be after the other yolk also. Okay. Anyway, so now we understand those parts. Now let's move ahead. The Rama says that if a person, in order to avoid blood spots, they're not very common, but you do have to check the eggs to make sure that there are no blood spots. And the Rama says you should check them. You must check eggs during the daytime. So I'm sorry. During the daytime, you must check the eggs. When it's not daytime, you don't have to check the eggs. Okay? So Shechta said, what does that mean? Why would I have only mitzvah during the daytime, not during the nighttime? So Shechta said, that means is that the Ikra Din is you can assume that your egg has no blood spot in it, because it's not very common at all. you can assume there's no egg, no spot in it. But when it's easy to do, when it's reasonably easy to do it, then it's, when we first talked about this in Kashrus, it's like callous to avoid, to not look. And therefore, when it's reasonably easy to do it, you're going to do that. And therefore, when there were, in those days, when there was no electric lights, during the daytime there was plenty of light. It was easy to check the eggs. During the nighttime, it was not. They had no electric lights. It was not easy to do it. Therefore, during the daytime, the person should check, because it's easy to do it and it's right in front of you, you should check it. During the nighttime, you're not mechuyev to check. Okay? Or another example, when I'm making hard-boiled eggs, okay? And hard-boiled egg, I'm going to cook the egg without checking for blood spots. And I'm not going to, in most cases, you can't see the blood spot afterwards. So basically, I'm sort of taking my chances, and that's fine, because you have to check as much as is reasonably possible. When it's not possible, like making a hard-boiled egg, you're not mechuyev to check. Okay? So this Ramah, as Rabbi Schechter explained it, has a modern application, which is nowadays we would check eggs by day and at night the same, because for us, it's just as easy to check it at night as it is by day. We have electric lights. But the nafkamina is in a liquid egg company. Liquid egg company buys eggs, they candle them to remove as many blood spots as they can, then they crack them and sell them as liquid eggs. So, in factory has to insist that there be a mashgiach standing there to check everything for blood spots. That's not considered easy. When you have to check it during the daytime, meaning when it's easy and simple, you should do that. So this doesn't qualify for that, and therefore, in liquid egg companies, they candle the eggs for their own purposes, but there's no mashgiach who stays there to make sure that all the eggs have no blood spots. In contrast, in a restaurant where we have mashgiach, assuming there's a mashgiach tzmidi in the restaurant, then it's easy. The mashgiach's standing there. So just one of his responsibilities could be to check the eggs, and therefore the standard procedure is that in those places, we do have to check the eggs for blood spots. But in a factory that makes liquid eggs, it's considered not simple or reasonable, easy to do it, and therefore you don't need to check the blood spots. Now, one last thing we need to speak about is something called protein spots. And that is as follows. I mentioned to you that if you crack eggs, it's not very common to find the blood spot. Every once in a while someone will find the blood spot, but it's not very common. However, if a person buys brown eggs, the claim is that, 10, 20, 30% of the eggs have spots in them. Okay, it's a common complaint that people have, that brown eggs have what appears to be lots of blood spots. And the companies who sell these eggs get loads of complaints about them. Consumers call all the time saying, I bought your eggs, and so many of them have blood spots in them. Okay, so at a certain point, those type of complaints came to the OU, because the OU was giving hashgacha on whole brown eggs. And people said, how can you give hashgacha on these eggs when so many of them have blood spots in them? Okay, so the OU Peskim would look into this and spoke to experts in the field, people who work with eggs, and particularly work with brown eggs, and they said as follows. The white part, the albumin of an egg, is primarily made out of protein. And what happens is, protein is translucent and sort of transparent also, and it has sort of no color to it. Well, but if you would look more carefully, you would notice that there are certain parts of the white of the egg that are thicker, or sort of clumping together of pieces of protein more than other parts. Now, in a regular white egg, you would never notice that. Maybe it seems a little bit whiter or thicker than other parts, but it would totally pass you by. You wouldn't pay any attention to it. But what happens with a brown egg is that when the chicken forms the shell around the egg, it forms a shell, and then it injects pigment to help give the egg its brown color to it. Some of that pigment leaks through the shell. It doesn't only stick to the outside, but leaks through into the abdomen, into the white part of the egg. And there again, you wouldn't notice it. It just gives the white part of the egg a little bit of a tinge of a color to it. You wouldn't notice that either. But in these clumps, where protein is a little thicker and more concentrated, in those clumps, the pigment collects and becomes concentrated and gives a dark color to it. And that's what people are seeing when they open up an egg. Which is to say is that what people are seeing there are these clumps of protein, but because the egg is a brown egg and it attracts the pigment, that is more noticeable. And if you look at it more carefully, you see that those spots, they're not red. On a regular egg, the blood spots, the blood spots on an egg look like blood, they're red. On these, in the brown eggs, they don't look red, they look brown. In other words, they're a concentrated version of the color of the egg's shell. Furthermore, in a regular egg, when you find a blood spot, the spot that you find looks like a spot. It looks like, think of what would happen if there was a drop of blood fell in. It would be roundish or sort of round, and it would look sort of like a drop of blood. What would happen if a drop fell into this thing over here? As opposed to these spots tend to be more like square-shaped or like dandruff. People look like a piece of dandruff, and they won't be symmetrical, they may have jagged edges, because they're really just a clump of protein. They're not, they're not blood at all. So, Rebelsky said, therefore, if a person looks at it and they can tell that it's not blood, when you look, now that you've heard that, if you look at it, you look more carefully, you see that it's brownish and it's not round, and it doesn't look like a regular blood spot, then it's mutter, and there's nothing wrong with eating those. Especially when we remember that even blood spots are only asim shamar zayin because they look like blood. Well, these don't look like blood, especially once you know the information. They don't look like blood, and therefore they're mutter. Schechter wasn't so convinced. He was a little concerned that there's this little chance of it being something called a meat spot. That's something very different. But also he said as well, there's a minhag, and the minhag is to not eat these kind of blood spots. Most housewives and most people open up an egg who hadn't heard what I just said for the past 3 minutes would open up the egg and say, hey, that's a blood spot. In fact, that's why people complain. So he thinks that should be potentially included in the minhag. And everybody can say, no, it's a minhag b'tois. The minhag is that blood spots, we don't eat the blood, and we don't eat the whole egg, as we mentioned. To extend it to this kind of thing, it's just a mistake. The people saw something that looked like a spot, but it wasn't a blood spot, it was a brown spot, and he thought that it should be mutter. Regardless of whether you think it should be mutter, also they thought that when, in fact, if there's hashgacha on it, then some kind of a notification has to be given, or some kind of a report, something that says that consumers should realize that the hashgacha is being granted, and that those spots are not regular blood spots.